The HOA president was standing in my yard, screeching into her dead phone, surrounded by men in suits with laptops that wouldn't load. Why? Because I dug up the fiber optic line they buried through my property without asking, and mailed them a $12,000 repair invoice with a smile. Oh, and I CC'd the county. Wanna know how it got this far? Buckle up. It started the way most disasters do, quietly and with paperwork I never received. A Tuesday morning, coffee in hand, sun peeking over the rooftops, and me, barefoot on the lawn inspecting a stubborn patch of crabgrass I swore I'd destroy before summer. That's when I noticed the flags. Orange, yellow, blue, little plastic markers sticking up from the grass like party decorations for utility companies. I hadn't ordered anything. I hadn't approved anything. And I sure as hell hadn't invited anyone to dig up my yard. By noon, there were trucks in my driveway. Not city trucks, not anything official. Just 2 vans marked with a logo I didn't recognize and a group of guys unloading what looked suspiciously like trenching equipment. Naturally, I asked what was going on. They ignored me. Literally. I walked over, polite at first, and said, "Hey, what are you guys doing here?" One guy glanced at me, gave a tight smile, and said, "Just following orders, sir," before slipping on his headphones and walking off like I was some confused old man yelling at clouds. They had already started tearing a line through my yard before I even finished my first cup of coffee. That wasn't just rude, it was suspicious. When I got home that evening, there was a thin, uneven strip of disturbed earth running diagonally across my front lawn like a scar. The grass had been sloppily replaced, like someone tried to cover it up in a hurry, and there was a sticky note on my front door. A literal sticky note. It said, "Routine HOA infrastructure upgrade. Thank you for your understanding." No signature. No explanation. Just the assumption that I'd be fine with whatever the hell they were doing. Spoiler, I wasn't. I left a voicemail at the HOA office. Then another. Then I emailed twice. No reply. Not even an autoresponse. That would have been annoying on its own, but things got weird when I checked with the city utilities department to find out what had been installed. A cheerful clerk looked up my address and said, "We don't have any new permits on file for your property, sir." I asked again. Same answer. I asked if the HOA had filed something under a neighborhood-wide infrastructure project. Still nothing. That's when I realized 2 things. 1, someone was lying. And 2, they were probably standing on my lawn doing it. The next day, I caught HOA President Linda strutting down the sidewalk in her salmon-pink windbreaker like she owned the neighborhood. You know the type. Permanent sunglasses, clipboard surgically attached to her hand, and an expression that said, "Your backyard shed might violate Article 4B. She saw me standing next to the trench and smiled like we were sharing an inside joke. I didn't smile back. "Linda," I said, "mind telling me what this is all about?" "Oh, it's just a fiber optic line," she said breezily. "We're upgrading the neighborhood's connectivity. It's a big win for everyone. Without asking? It's common property. It runs through everyone's yard." "Except this yard," I replied. She gave me a patronizing chuckle and said, "You signed the agreement, dear. Everyone in the HOA did. There was just one problem with that. I didn't. Because I wasn't part of the HOA. See, here's the twist. My house was the original model home built before the HOA was formed. I bought it from the builder directly, years before Linda and her rule-happy army of clipboard warriors came to power. They'd tried to rope me in before, sent me letters, welcoming me to the HOA and outlining dues I never agreed to pay. But the county confirmed it back then, and again now. My house was grandfathered in. Not subject to HOA rules. Not under their jurisdiction. In other words, my yard was not their playground. But clearly, Linda either forgot, didn't care, or hoped I wouldn't notice. I noticed. I didn't blow up. Not yet. I'm a patient man, and besides, I like my revenge like I like my whiskey. Slow and neat. But inside? I was already picturing her face when this all came crashing down. I told her I'd be looking into it and walked away before she could start quoting bylaws like scripture. That night, I pulled up every property record I could find. County map, utility permit, HOA filings, and there it was, in black and white. No easement, no legal right to alter my property, no documentation from any utility provider authorizing a dig. That line running through my yard wasn't just presumptuous, it was illegal, which made my next decision very, very easy. Of course, I didn't go full chainsaw just yet. I started documenting everything, took photos of the trench, measured the depth, marked where the cable was visible, and took note of the shoddy workmanship. I even noticed the line was buried shallower than code required, probably a rush job. They didn't expect anyone to push back. I sent one last email to the HOA, purely for the paper trail. No response. Not even a read receipt. So I waited. And while I waited, I made a plan. Because if Linda thought I was going to let this go, she was sorely mistaken. She picked the wrong yard, the wrong neighbor, and definitely the wrong guy to test. And just when I thought it couldn't get any worse, or funnier, I received a package in the mail. An HOA bulletin. Glossy, full color, complete with a full-page message from Linda herself. Thanks to your support, our new neighborhood fiber optic upgrade is live. Enjoy faster service at no additional cost to you. We appreciate your patience during installation. My jaw dropped. I didn't get faster service. I didn't even get a login. Because they had built a system I wasn't allowed to use, on my property, without permission. I smiled. Because in that moment I knew something they didn't. I knew exactly where the line was. And more importantly, I knew exactly where to cut. But before I tell you how I turned a fiber cable into a $12,000 invoice and a meltdown so epic it practically caused a neighborhood civil war, you should probably know what happened when I pulled out the shovel. Because that's when the real chaos started. So yeah, by the time I pulled out the shovel, I already had every legal document I needed and a mental image of Linda's smug little smile snapping in half. The thing about people like her is that they operate on assumptions. She assumed no one would question her authority. She assumed I wouldn't know my rights. She assumed I'd roll over like some pushover neighbor who cared more about lawn stripes than property law. What she didn't know is that I'd spent 6 years working as a civil engineer before switching to freelance work. I knew how to read a plat map, how to file municipal complaints, and exactly how deep a fiber optic line is supposed to be buried to meet code. So when I say I was ready, I mean I was one mild inconvenience away from going full trench warfare. The best part? I didn't even need to go looking for that final push. It found me. 3 days after the glossy HOA newsletter hit my mailbox, I came home from the grocery store to find a note taped to my door. This one wasn't a sticky note. This one was printed on letterhead, folded in an envelope, and delivered like it was from the Queen of England herself. It read, "Dear homeowner, failure to maintain the visual aesthetic of your lawn following infrastructure updates may result in penalties as outlined in the HOA charter." Followed by a polite reminder to resod the trench area promptly to ensure visual consistency for the community. The audacity! Not only had they violated my property rights, buried illegal infrastructure across my yard, and ignored every form of communication I'd sent them, they were now fining me for not cleaning up their mess. I laughed. Out loud. Alone in my kitchen, holding that letter and cackling like a maniac. Because if they wanted to go by the book, I had a whole damn library ready. And page 1 was about to be their nightmare. The next morning, I drove down to the county records office. Not a website. Not a phone call. I wanted physical papers, signed and stamped, in case things went nuclear. The clerk, a sleepy guy named Dave with a coffee stain on his shirt, printed everything I needed. Property lines, utility easements, subdivision map. He even chuckled when I told him what the HOA did. "Yeah, that's not legal," he said, scanning one of the documents. "They didn't get an easement filed for that trench. They're gonna regret that." That was the first domino. With my documents in hand, I snapped photos of the trench and the cable itself. I even lifted a piece of sod to show how shallow it was buried, 6 inches instead of the minimum 12. Then, just to be extra, I called a buddy of mine who still worked in city infrastructure and asked him to swing by. He brought a voltage tester and confirmed it was active fiber, not some abandoned or capped-off line. The kicker? It wasn't even properly insulated from ground moisture. A few more rainstorms and that thing would have corroded into spaghetti. I now had enough ammo to take this to court. But why waste the money on a lawsuit when I could go full petty for free? I marked the line with little red flags and waited for a Saturday. Nothing suspicious about doing yard work on a weekend, right? I even invited a few friends over under the pretense of backyard beers and barbecue. We made a whole afternoon of it. Burgers, beers, music, and a 6-foot trench across my front yard like we were hunting for pirate treasure. Every time someone asked what we were digging, I smiled and said, "Just cleaning up the mess the HOA left." They said I'm responsible for the lawn, after all. Eventually, I found it. A thick black cable running exactly where I expected. I followed it with my little trench until I hit the connection box, a small, gray metal enclosure half buried under mulch. No lock, no warning, just sitting there like an invitation. One satisfying twist of a wrench later, and the entire cable was disconnected. I didn't cut it. I'm not a criminal. I simply removed it from my property the same way someone might pull out weeds or broken sprinkler pipe. Technically, all I did was clean up my yard. 15 minutes later, the neighborhood's internet collapsed like a dying star. At first, I didn't notice, but then my phone lit up with texts from neighbors. "Is your Wi-Fi down? Did you lose service? What the hell is going on?" I just kept grilling. But then came the queen herself. Linda showed up storming across the lawn in a panic, flanked by 2 board members and a pair of guys in khakis holding laptops like they were defusing bombs. She was shouting into her phone, well, trying to. It wasn't working. The irony was so thick I could have paved my driveway with it. She saw me leaning against my shovel and pointed like she was summoning lightning. "What did you do?" I tilted my head. "Sorry, what?" "The network. The internet. We have a critical infrastructure outage." I looked around. "I'm just doing some landscaping. HOA said I was responsible for restoring the lawn. You sent me a letter." Her face contorted like someone shoved a lemon wedge into her mouth. She started shouting something about vandalism and consequences and legal action, but I just walked past her, into my house, and came back with a manila envelope. Inside? Printed photos, map, a copy of my property deed, a letter I had prepared ahead of time, with a signature from my lawyer friend at the bottom, and most importantly, a bill. The invoice was itemized. Lawn restoration, $2,400. Fence repair, yes, the trench cracked one of my fence posts, $1,200. Property devaluation based on unauthorized construction, calculated at $8,400, based on precedent and legal estimate. Total, $12,000 due within 30 days. Failure to pay would result in legal action, including a lien against the HOA's common asset. Linda didn't take it well. She snatched the envelope, flipped through the pages, and then did the worst possible thing she could do in that moment. She laughed. "Nice try. You think we're just going to pay you 12 grand because you dug up our line?" "No," I said. "I think you're going to pay me because I can prove you broke the law." One of the board members pulled him aside. They started whispering. I couldn't hear everything, but I caught enough to know they were nervous. Apparently, none of them had actually filed permits for the installation. The contractor they hired was supposed to handle that stuff, which they didn't. And now, their infrastructure upgrade was sitting like a dead snake in my front yard, unplugged and very, very illegal. Linda spun back toward me with narrowed eyes. "You're going to regret this." "I doubt it," I said, wiping my hands on a towel. "But you know what you might regret? not checking the mail tomorrow. Because what she didn't know was that I'd already CC'd the county on the whole situation. And a letter was already en route to their office. Certified mail, receipt required. And oh, the next part? That's when the cops show up. When the cops pulled up the next day, I was halfway through replacing the torn-up sod in my yard, headphones in, listening to classic rock while giving my lawn the attention it deserved. I didn't even notice the patrol car until a shadow passed across my shovel. I looked up to see two officers, one older guy with a coffee in hand and a younger one who looked like he was still getting used to the badge. They weren't aggressive, just that professional, measured posture cops use when they have no idea what they're walking into. The older one greeted me politely and asked if I was the homeowner. I said yes, and before I could even guess why they were here, Linda came marching down the street like she was leading a parade. She was in full battle mode, sunglasses on, lips pursed, carrying a manila folder stuffed to the brim. The two HOA board members were trailing behind her, looking slightly less enthusiastic this time, probably because they knew deep down they were walking into a mess they had helped create. Linda wasted no time. She pointed at me and launched into her performance. She claimed I had damaged essential neighborhood infrastructure, that I had tampered with critical utilities, and that I was endangering the entire community. She even waved a printout of some HOA document as if it were a court order. The younger cop looked confused. The older one kept sipping his coffee and then turned to me. "Mind telling us your side?" I nodded, calm as anything, and pulled out a second envelope I had prepared ahead of time. Inside were my property records, the county maps, a copy of the email chain showing I had contacted the HOA about the trench, and the lack of response. I included photos, timestamps, and even a printout from the city's permitting office that clearly showed no infrastructure project had been filed for my address. I didn't need to sell it hard. I just laid it out plainly and waited. The older cop flipped through the paperwork and raised an eyebrow. "So you're not part of the HOA?" "Nope. Never have been. They keep pretending I am, though." "And this line was installed without your permission?" "Correct. And without a permit. That trench? That cable? Not only did they dig it through my yard without asking, but they also buried it too shallow, ignored safety codes, and then sent me a fine for not cleaning up after them." Linda cut in, her voice shrill, trying to redirect the conversation. She kept waving her folder and talking over me, but the younger officer finally asked her the million-dollar question. "Ma'am, do you have a copy of the permit for this installation?" That shut her up for a beat. She blinked, then muttered something about the contractor handling it. The officer pressed again. "So the HOA didn't file any formal request with the city or get approval from the homeowner before digging?" Linda looked to the board members for backup. They stared at the sidewalk like it had suddenly become fascinating. One of them finally said, "We assumed it was covered under community improvements." The older cop handed her back her stack of papers. "Assumptions aren't permits." At that point, Linda's face went pale. She tried pivoting to some nonsense about neighborhood safety and community service, but the damage was done. The officers made it clear this was a civil matter, and from what they could see, I had every right to remove an illegally installed cable from my property. The cherry on top was when they advised Linda that if she kept pushing this, the HOA could be fined for unauthorized utility work. That was the first time she looked genuinely worried. They left without issuing any citations or warnings. In fact, the older officer even gave me a subtle nod as he walked back to the car, like he was silently rooting for me. Linda, on the other hand, stood in my yard like she couldn't process what had just happened. She muttered something about talking to legal, and stormed off in a huff, her little army scrambling after her. I figured that would be the end of it. But no. This was Linda we were dealing with. 2 days later, I received an official-looking envelope from a law office on the other side of town. It was a cease and desist letter, accusing me of willful destruction of HOA property, threatening legal action, and demanding immediate payment for the repair of the fiber optic line. It was poorly written, full of vague threats and passive-aggressive phrasing, clearly not from a top-tier firm. I almost felt insulted. If you're going to try and intimidate someone, at least hire a lawyer who knows what the word easement means. Instead of responding directly, I forwarded the letter to my actual lawyer friend. He read it, laughed, and drafted a reply that was equal parts professional and lethal. In it, we reiterated my property rights, attached all the supporting documentation again, and added a friendly reminder that if the HOA pursued this matter further, we'd be happy to open discovery, which would include depositions, internal HOA communications, and records of financial transactions related to the unauthorized project. We finished the letter by restating the $12,000 invoice and included a line that read, "We strongly recommend payment be rendered promptly to avoid further liability." A week passed. No response. 2 weeks. Silence. Then came the next development. A neighborhood meeting notice slipped under everyone's door. An emergency session of the HOA board, open to all residents. The agenda? Infrastructure issues and board transparency. Translation: damage control. I went. Not because I cared what they had to say, but because I wanted to watch it all unfold. The turnout was massive. People packed into the community center, neighbors who usually ignored meetings suddenly showing up with questions. And it didn't take long before Linda was put on the spot. A man in the back stood up and asked why his internet was still out. A woman in the front asked who had approved the trenching. Another guy wanted to know how they picked the contractor. Questions kept coming, piling on top of each other until Linda was visibly sweating. She stammered through some rehearsed line about streamlining communication and unexpected logistical setbacks, but it wasn't landing. The crowd wasn't buying it anymore. Then came the best part. A neighbor stood up and said he'd checked his own property records and realized, just like me, he wasn't legally part of the HOA either. Turns out, several homes along the original development line had been built before the charter was finalized. The HOA had been bluffing their authority for years, and no one had bothered to check. Until now. By the end of the meeting, it was clear. The board was fractured, the neighborhood was angry, and Linda was standing on a foundation built entirely out of lies and assumptions. I didn't even need to say a word. I just sat there, arms crossed, enjoying the implosion. The silence from the HOA after that was almost suspicious. I expected another letter, another threat, something. But instead, nothing. Then, 3 days later, a certified letter arrived. Inside was a check. Made out for the full amount. $12,000. No apology. No explanation. Just payment. But this story wasn't over yet. Because even though they paid, they hadn't learned their lesson. And that's why, just when I thought it was all over, the Fibre line came back. At first, I thought it was some kind of joke. A prank. A final middle finger from Linda before she packed up her HOA-branded clipboard and disappeared into whatever gated community she was destined to retire in. Because one afternoon, about a month after I received the check and assumed we were done playing trench warfare, I came home to find a crew of guys standing on my lawn again. Different uniforms this time, but the same equipment. Same orange flags. Same smug, clipboard-wielding supervisor barking orders while ignoring the homeowner whose land they were standing on like I was a lamppost. I walked right up and asked what they were doing. The guy in charge didn't even blink. Said they were reinstalling the Fibre line per the HOA's new easement agreement. I stared at him for a second, then laughed. Not the polite kind. The kind of laugh that starts in your chest and spills out like you've just heard the most ridiculous thing in the world. Because what easement agreement? I hadn't signed anything. I hadn't been contacted. And unless I'd developed amnesia, no legal document had magically appeared giving them the right to dig up my yard again. I asked to see the permit. He couldn't produce one. Asked for a supervisor's contact. He gave me a number that went to voicemail. Then he shrugged and said, "Not his problem. He's just following orders." I stood there, stunned for a moment, before turning around and walking back into my house. I didn't yell. I didn't threaten. I didn't even argue. I just sat down, opened my laptop, and got to work. First, I called the county office and confirmed what I already suspected. Still no permit. Then I pulled up the most recent HOA bulletin, and sure enough, buried in the last paragraph of page 3, was a vague announcement about network reinstatement efforts. No timeline, no addresses, no contact info. Just an implication that, somehow, this was all pre-approved. That's when it clicked. They weren't just reinstalling the line. They were trying to set precedent. If they could get it in the ground and operational again, they could argue it was a utility, and under some loophole, force the issue legally. It was a play straight out of Linda's passive-aggressive war manual. Don't fight directly. Just wear people down until they stop resisting. Unfortunately for them, I don't wear down. I sharpen. So, I waited until they were finished. Let them dig the trench, lay the line, patch the lawn. I watched through the window while sipping tea, waving once or twice just to really get under their skin. And then, the moment they left, I made 2 calls. First, to my buddy who worked with city compliance. I explained the situation, and within 2 hours, I had a municipal inspector in my driveway. He took one look at the trench depth and installation notes and immediately started jotting things down. Violations, code breaches, failure to file permits, everything. Then, just to be extra helpful, I handed him a copy of the letter I'd received from the HOA lawyer during the original conflict. He read it, frowned, and said, "Oh, they're going to love this at the next hearing." The second call I made was to my lawyer friend. We drafted a new letter, this one far less polite than the first. It outlined the repeated trespass, the intentional reinstallation of unauthorized infrastructure, and the attempt to fabricate an easement where none existed. We included a demand for removal within 72 hours, plus an increased invoice for the new damages, another $4,800. This time, we stated clearly that failure to comply would result in a formal lawsuit filed in civil court. The HOA didn't respond. But this time, that silence wasn't just them being lazy or arrogant. It was fear. Because word had started to spread. The city inspector had reported his findings, and the HOA was now facing actual municipal penalties, fines, investigations, and most importantly, angry homeowners who were starting to realize just how deep this rabbit hole went. It only took 3 days for the unraveling to begin. First, Linda announced her resignation. Officially, it was for personal reasons, but anyone who had attended that last board meeting knew it was because the pressure had finally crushed her. Turns out, half the board didn't even know she had authorized the second installation. She'd acted unilaterally, hoping that if it worked, they'd all just pretend it was a win. But it didn't work. And now, the same neighbors who used to quietly nod along with her rules were demanding receipts, accountability, and her head on a metaphorical platter. Next, the contractor who did the second installation came under fire. They were fined for multiple violations, including digging without a permit and ignoring utility safety protocols. One of the crew members even flipped during questioning and admitted that they were told not to engage the homeowner if he asked questions. That made the city's case even stronger. And with that, the fiber line was officially ordered to be removed. But here's where it gets better. The new HOA president, a much more reasonable woman named Carla, showed up at my door personally. She was nervous, apologetic, and clearly embarrassed by everything that had happened. She handed me a check for the $4,800, apologized for the mismanagement, and assured me that under her leadership, this kind of thing would never happen again. I nodded politely, accepted the check, and handed her a typed letter I had prepared ahead of time. It stated that any future attempts to install infrastructure on my property without written consent would result in immediate legal action, and that under no circumstances would I be accepting HOA jurisdiction retroactively or otherwise. I even had it notarized just for fun. Carla took it without argument, thanked me for my time, and left. That should have been the end of the story. The HOA lost, Linda was out, I had my lawn and my money, and the fiber line was gone for good. But the truth is, I still get neighbors stopping me in the street to ask how I did it. Not just the legal stuff, though I get asked about that plenty, but the nerve, the calm, the absolute refusal to back down. And honestly, it wasn't about being brave or stubborn. It was about principle. You don't just walk into someone's yard and start digging without asking. You don't bully your way into control and expect everyone to smile and thank you for the privilege. And you sure as hell don't try to steamroll someone who reads contracts for fun and once threatened to sue an airline for mislabeling overhead bin space. So yeah, maybe I went a little overboard. Maybe I could have let it slide. But every time I see that empty stretch of lawn where the trench used to be, I feel a little spark of joy. Because it's more than just grass. It's a line. A boundary. A reminder that when someone tries to bury their power in your yard, you don't just dig it up. You make them pay for the shovel too.